Aileen Wuornos, America's most infamous serial killer prostitute. Let's begin with the case that practically redefined the public's understanding of female serial killers in the United States. A case where trauma, survival instinct, violence, and opportunism merged into one of the most disturbing criminal patterns of late 20th century America. The story of Aileen Carol Wuornos. Born in 1956 in Michigan to a teenage mother and a father who was later imprisoned for sex crimes against children, Aileen's early childhood reads more like the opening chapter of a tragedy than a biography. By the time she was 11, she was living in the woods behind her grandparents' home, exchanging sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and money. Her grandfather was notoriously abusive. Her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. Every door to a normal life slammed shut before she even reached adolescence. By the late 1980s, Aileen was drifting through Florida's highways, making a living as a hitchhiker prostitute. She developed a reputation among truckers and lonely motorists as tough, unpredictable, and capable of turning violent at the slightest hint of disrespect. But nothing suggested that she was on the verge of one of the most infamous killing sprees in American criminal history. Between late 1989 and 1990, 7 men disappeared after picking up a woman hitchhiking along Florida highways. Their bodies told the story Aileen later tried to deny. Richard Mallory, the first confirmed victim, was found shot several times. Aileen insisted Mallory attempted to rape her, but an important detail emerged. She took Mallory's car and pawned his belongings. The pattern repeated with 6 other men: Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Walter Gino Antonio, Troy Burris, David Spears, and Charles Humphreys. Mostly middle-aged, mostly traveling alone, all of them killed by gunshots at close range. And as investigators later noted, all of them robbed. Police found the clues through a bizarre sequence of mistakes. Aileen crashed one of the victims' cars, fled the scene, and left behind her bloody handprint. Witnesses described the women running from the wreck as scruffy, angry, and clearly intoxicated. The sketch went statewide. Aileen's fingerprints, already in police databases from decades of arrests, matched. The FBI, Florida State Police, and local investigators formed a multi-agency task force. Within days, they traced her to a biker bar in Port Orange, the last resort. The name couldn't have been more symbolic. Aileen was arrested on January 9, 1991. Her partner and lover, Tyria Moore, was pressured into cooperating. Tyria agreed to call Aileen from a police-monitored motel room, pleading with her to confess and help save her from implication. After several recorded calls, Aileen cracked. "I'm so sorry, Ty," she said. "I did it. I'll confess." The confession was a whirlwind of contradictions. She insisted repeatedly that she killed in self-defense, claiming every victim had tried to assault or rape her. But the forensic evidence, bullet trajectories, robbery patterns, the condition of the bodies, showed something far less reactive and far more calculated. Aileen shot victims even when they were already incapacitated. She took their vehicles, pawned their belongings, and left scenes in ways suggesting a consistent modus operandi, not spontaneous panic. During her 1992 trial, prosecutors emphasized not just the brutality but the consistency of her killings. Witness after witness described her violent temper, her admissions in bars, her history of aggression. Her statements to the press made matters worse. In one notorious outburst, she yelled to reporters, "I'd kill again. I hate men. I hope you all get raped." It wasn't exactly the kind of testimony that wins sympathy from a jury. Ultimately, she was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Her final years on death row were filled with increasingly erratic statements. At one point, she claimed a sonic pressure weapon was destroying her brain. At another, she insisted she killed in cold blood and that her earlier self-defense claims were lies. Her mental health was deteriorating, and even her own defense team later described her as profoundly traumatized, profoundly unstable. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her final statement was, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back." 7 men dead. A lifetime of trauma compressed into a single violent survival script, and a case that continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and filmmakers alike because Aileen blurred the lines between victim and predator. She was undeniably shaped by a devastating early life, but equally undeniably, she became the architect of her own devastating violence. Dorothea Puente is a name that sounds almost innocuous at first glance. Dorothea evokes quaint charm, perhaps a kindly neighbor baking cookies. Yet in reality, she was a woman whose domestic veneer concealed a chilling capacity for deception, manipulation, and murder. Her story is an intersection of sex work, exploitation, and methodical criminality, a case that illustrates how ordinary facades can mask extraordinary evil. Born in 1929 in Redlands, California, Dorothea's early life was steeped in dysfunction. She was the product of a household plagued by poverty, instability, and abuse. By her teenage years, she had already encountered the criminal justice system, arrested for petty theft and other minor offenses. As a young adult, Dorothea drifted in and out of marriages, using relationships and charm to secure financial and material advantage. Like many women in mid-20th century America who faced limited options, she occasionally worked in the sex industry, offering companionship or sexual services to men in exchange for money or shelter. While this phase of her life was not unique, it became an important skill set in her later criminal exploits. She knew how to attract vulnerable people, gain their trust, and manipulate them. By the 1970s, Puente had transitioned into a more respectable role, or at least the appearance of one. She established a boarding house in Sacramento, California, catering primarily to the elderly, the disabled, and the socially marginalized. Her charm, apparent generosity, and maternal demeanor made her seem harmless, even saintly. To authorities and neighbors, she was the grandmother who looked after the lonely and the weak. Yet, behind this friendly exterior lay a calculating mind that had learned early in life how to exploit human vulnerabilities for personal gain. The method of her crimes was as subtle as it was horrifying. Dorothea would lure her tenants with promises of affordable rent and care. She would collect their social security checks and welfare payments, positioning herself as the indispensable caretaker. Once she had control, she would poison her victims, typically using a combination of sedatives and other chemicals designed to mimic natural death. When the body was discovered, it often appeared to have died of natural causes, allowing Dorothea to continue her scheme undetected for months or even years. This slow, deliberate method required patience, precision, and a profound lack of empathy. Over time, however, the pattern became unsustainable. In 1988, authorities discovered several bodies buried in the yard of her boarding house, including those of elderly men and women who had mysteriously disappeared over the preceding years. Investigators, some recalling the tactics of seasoned detectives from noir fiction, noted that Puente's charm and domesticity had been her greatest weapon. She made people feel safe while planning their deaths. In total, 9 victims were confirmed, although suspicions linger that the number may have been higher. Among them were elderly tenants whose disabilities made them entirely reliant on her, a detail that only intensified the moral horror of her actions. Her connections to sex work, though largely historical by this point, played a role in shaping her criminal profile. Dorothea understood human desire, manipulation, and trust. She had learned how to enter someone's life under the guise of need or intimacy, and she perfected this skill over decades. Whereas many serial killers operate through physical intimidation or explosive violence, Puente's method was psychological, patient, and insidiously domestic. Her victims often did not perceive the threat until it was too late. She was, in essence, a serial killer who weaponized empathy and dependence. The legal proceedings were a spectacle in themselves. Puente's trial drew widespread media attention, partly because she appeared so ordinary and partly because of the calculated nature of her crimes. Prosecutors argued that she had methodically poisoned and buried her tenants to claim their government benefits, emphasizing the premeditated and financially motivated aspects of her murders. Defense attorneys tried to portray her as a caregiver who had acted out of stress or mental illness, but the overwhelming evidence, multiple exhumed bodies, patterns of financial exploitation, and witness testimony painted a different picture. In 1993, Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 murders, with life sentences imposed without the possibility of parole. While only 3 convictions were secured, her legacy as a serial killer who leveraged charm, sex work experience, and trust to commit murder remained indelible. Her psychological profile fascinates criminologists. Dorothea exhibits many traits of what experts call organized psychopaths: meticulous planning, attention to detail, and the ability to mask evil under a veneer of normalcy. Her experience in sex work and in manipulating interpersonal dynamics provided her with insights into human behavior that she later exploited to deadly effect. Moreover, her crimes raise difficult moral questions about vulnerability, societal neglect, and the mechanisms by which individuals prey upon those society fails to protect. Beyond the courtroom and criminal files, Puente's story illuminates cultural and social dynamics. Boarding houses like hers often attract isolated elderly or disabled people who lack strong family networks. In this context, the intersection of vulnerability and criminal intent becomes tragically clear. Dorothea's life is not merely a case study in murder. It is a lesson in how social isolation, systemic neglect, and human cunning can collide in deadly ways. In some ways, there is a grim humor in the notion that the very skill set that once made Puente a minor figure in sex work, charm, seduction, understanding desires, later evolved into her primary criminal tool. She turned the ordinary, even mundane aspects of human interaction into instruments of death. The horror of this is amplified by the ordinariness of her demeanor. A grandmotherly figure, cooking in the kitchen, taking in lodgers, while beneath the surface lay a calculating killer. Dorothea Puente died in prison in 2011, having spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. Her story remains one of the most fascinating, terrifying, and instructive cases in American criminal history. It bridges the gap between social vulnerability and serial predation, between ordinary life and extraordinary criminality. 9 confirmed victims, countless potential additional ones, and a legacy that continues to inform criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement about the dark potentials hidden behind everyday facades. Dorothea Puente's life and crimes are reminders that evil can appear charming, domestic, and unthreatening, and that patience, cunning, and meticulous calculation can make a killer almost invisible until the inevitable discovery. Susan Monica's story is one that intertwines isolation, opportunism, and a dark creativity in crime. Unlike more publicly notorious female serial killers, Monica operated in relative obscurity for years, combining her past experience in sex work with the seclusion of rural life to craft a chilling criminal narrative that preyed upon trust, labor, and male vulnerability. Her case is a window into how a once marginalized individual can exploit social systems, human desire, and isolation to lethal effect. Born in the mid-20th century, Susan's early life details are less documented than those of high-profile killers like Aileen Wuornos. But it is clear that she spent formative years navigating challenging social and economic circumstances. In her youth, she engaged in sex work, sometimes as a means of survival, other times partially as a source of income. This phase of her life honed certain skills: understanding human desire, reading intentions, and exploiting trust, skills that, chillingly, she would later use in the orchestration of murders. By the 1990s, Susan had relocated to a rural area in Oregon, taking up residence on a small, isolated farm. Here, she adopted the persona of a self-sufficient, hard-working woman, quietly offering seasonal labor to men seeking help with farm work, maintenance, or domestic projects. It was a setting that provided both anonymity and control. Visitors arrived at her doorstep, believing they were engaging in a mundane, transactional arrangement. Few could have imagined the danger they would encounter. The method of Susan Monica's crimes combined cunning, patience, and practical concealment. Unlike killers who rely on overt violence, Monica leveraged her rural property, specifically a small-scale farm, to dispose of evidence in ways that initially escaped detection. Victims who came for work or casual encounters would disappear. Bodies, when found, were partially fed to livestock, particularly pigs, a tactic she employed to obscure forensic evidence. This method is horrifying not only because of the violence involved, but because it demonstrates a practical, almost logistical approach to murder. It required forethought, planning, and a chillingly dispassionate perspective on human life. 2 victims have been officially confirmed, men who responded to job offers or other requests for assistance. Investigators discovered remains that could be matched via DNA, supplemented by circumstantial evidence linking Monica to their last known whereabouts. However, suspicions remain that her total number of victims may have been higher, possibly reaching 7. The relatively low-profile nature of her crimes, combined with rural isolation, delayed investigation and contributed to her ability to operate undetected for years. In essence, her environment became both a shield and a tool. Susan Monica's prior involvement in sex work played a subtle but significant role in the criminal pattern. While not all victims were approached in a sexual context, the skills she had developed, charm, the ability to gain the trust of men, an understanding of how to manipulate expectations, facilitated the acts of predation. It is a stark reminder that knowledge and experience, even those obtained in socially stigmatized or marginal circumstances, can be weaponized with deadly efficiency when combined with malicious intent. Her arrest came after local law enforcement began connecting disappearances with her property. Once authorities began investigating, the disturbing reality of her operations emerged. Piles of animal feed, suspicious farming activities, and unaccounted-for laborers or visitors drew attention. Forensic investigation, while complicated by the use of livestock in disposing of bodies, eventually established links sufficient for charges. The evidence was clear enough to ensure conviction. Monica's actions were deliberate, repeated, and concealed with knowledge of their criminal implications. Susan Monica's trial highlighted both her methodical approach and the psychological profile of a female serial killer who operated with strategic patience rather than immediate violence. She exhibited traits of control, meticulous planning, and the ability to manipulate trust and circumstance to her advantage. Criminologists studying her case emphasize how environment, social skill, and prior marginalization combined to allow her to commit murder undetected for an extended period. The case challenges conventional assumptions about the archetypes of serial killers. She was not overtly flamboyant, she did not rely on traditional weaponry in a public sense, and she remained in many ways socially invisible. Her victims' disappearances, though tragic, were largely unremarked upon for months, a testament to the dangers posed by isolation and social neglect. Susan Monica's crimes also provide insight into the intersections of rural life, social invisibility, and criminal opportunity. In isolated communities, individuals can sometimes operate outside the scrutiny of neighbors, family, or public systems, especially when they present themselves as helpful, competent, or industrious. Monica's ability to maintain the appearance of normalcy underscores the importance of vigilance, social networks, and law enforcement in detecting patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. Her story is a dark reflection on how opportunity and premeditation can exploit human trust, loneliness, and desperation. Ultimately, Susan Monica's confirmed victims number 2, with suspicions of up to 7, and her modus operandi, using her property and livestock to dispose of evidence, combined with her prior experience in sex work to facilitate access to victims, cements her as one of the more unusual cases of female serial predation in American criminal history. She stands as a cautionary example of the ways marginalization, isolation, and cunning can intersect with lethal creativity. The case leaves a lingering question for criminologists, psychologists, and true crime observers alike. How many potential killers operate quietly on the margins of society, leveraging trust, opportunity, and knowledge to conceal predation? Susan Monica's life is a sobering study in how ordinary environments, a farm, a workshop, a chance meeting, can become stages for extraordinary violence. It reminds us that the most unsettling predators may appear harmless, even beneficial, while orchestrating acts of unimaginable cruelty just beneath the surface. Velma Barfield's story is a haunting illustration of how ordinary domesticity and hidden violence can intertwine, transforming someone who seemed like a mundane figure into a methodical serial killer. Born in 1932 in South Carolina, Velma was raised in a world where strict societal norms, family dysfunction, and economic hardship converged to shape her personality. Her early life was marked by instability and exposure to domestic violence, factors that experts often cite as formative in the development of antisocial behaviors later in life. Yet, what makes Velma especially notable is her progression from conventional roles, wife, mother, caretaker, to a woman capable of calculated lethal murder. Velma married young, became a mother, and moved to North Carolina, attempting to live a conventional life. Her family relationships were often strained. She experienced emotional neglect and had episodes of domestic tension. Over time, these pressures, combined with a possible desire for financial independence and control, drove her into behaviors that would later define her criminal career. At some point, Velma briefly worked as a prostitute, although this was not the defining element of her criminal identity. Rather, it was the access and insight into human vulnerability that this period offered, which she would later exploit in her killings. She understood dependency, trust, and the quiet ways one could manipulate people who depended on her. Velma Barfield's primary criminal method was poisoning. Using arsenic and other slow-acting chemicals, she would administer doses to men in her life, often those to whom she had domestic or personal access. Unlike killers who rely on sudden bursts of violence, Velma's approach was meticulous and patient. She selected victims carefully, ensuring they were within her sphere of influence, spouses, partners, and men who trusted her. The poisoning often mimicked natural causes, allowing her actions to go undetected for extended periods. This method reveals an unsettling combination of patience, intelligence, and moral detachment. She could calculate dosages, timing, and the conditions necessary to avoid immediate suspicion. Her first confirmed murders occurred in the 1970s and 1980s. She targeted men with whom she had intimate or financial relationships, often extracting monetary gain or a sense of control from the situation. 4 murders were confirmed, although suspicion lingered around as many as 7 potential victims. One of her earliest victims was her boyfriend, whose death initially appeared to be from natural causes. Subsequent forensic investigations, including post-mortem testing for arsenic, revealed the truth. Velma had slowly poisoned him over weeks, exploiting his trust and her domestic access. Velma's case became particularly notable because she was sentenced to death. a rare occurrence for women in the United States at the time. Her trial in the 1980s captivated public attention, partly due to her calm, almost unassuming demeanor, which contrasted sharply with the horror of her actions. Prosecutors painted her as a calculated killer, systematically exploiting her access to male victims through domestic or professional interactions. Defense teams attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing her troubled upbringing and emotional instability. Nevertheless, the weight of evidence, including witness testimony, financial records, and toxicological reports, left little room for doubt. Velma Barfield was convicted and ultimately became the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. Her execution by lethal injection in 1984 marked a grim milestone in criminal history. Velma's psychological profile reveals a woman who combined domestic skill with manipulative intelligence. She understood the ways in which human relationships, trust, and dependency could be leveraged to exert power, often to deadly effect. While she occasionally engaged in sex work, her murders were less about sexual gratification and more about control, revenge, or practical gain. Criminologists note that her methods reflect characteristics of what is often called the organized female serial killer: patient, calculated, and deeply integrated into her victims' lives. Unlike more impulsive killers, Velma planned meticulously, selecting victims who were already within her sphere of influence. Her case also underscores how societal assumptions about women's domestic roles can obscure criminal behavior. A neighborly housewife, a caretaker, or a girlfriend might seem incapable of extreme violence. But Velma exploited these perceptions, blending in with expectations of normality while orchestrating death in plain sight. Her story challenges the stereotype that female killers act primarily out of emotional outbursts or temporary rage. Instead, she demonstrates how cunning, patience, and an understanding of human trust can serve as potent instruments of crime. Velma Barfield's legacy is complex. She serves as both a warning and a case study, a reminder that domesticity can mask lethal intent, and that trust and intimacy can be exploited with devastating consequences. Her murders, slow and methodical, were almost invisible until discovered through forensic science and investigative persistence. They highlight the unique ways in which female serial killers can operate, blending patience, deception, and access into a pattern of lethal exploitation. 4 confirmed deaths, up to 7 suspected, and an execution that became a landmark in U.S. criminal justice history cement her as a significant figure in the study of violent women. In the end, Velma Barfield's story leaves an uneasy impression. Her calm exterior, her ability to maintain the appearance of a conventional life, and her methodical approach to murder remind us that evil is not always loud, dramatic, or easily identifiable. It can reside in the quiet spaces of domestic life, in the subtle manipulations of trust, in the very places where one expects safety. Velma's life and crimes offer crucial lessons for criminologists, psychologists, and society at large. Vigilance, understanding of human behavior, and recognition of patterns are essential in detecting danger before it can claim more victims. In her case, it claimed at least 4 men, and potentially several more, leaving a legacy of terror cloaked in ordinary domesticity. Judy Buenoano, often referred to as the Black Widow, is a name that evokes calculated malevolence and the terrifying potential of financial greed intertwined with murder. Born Julius Welty in 1943 in Minnesota, she would later adopt the surname Buenoano after moving to Florida. Her early life was marked by instability, but it was in her adult years that her capacity for manipulation and lethal cunning truly emerged. Judy's life is a disturbing testament to how ambition, opportunity, and remorselessness can converge to create a serial predator. Buenoano's criminal career is particularly chilling because it involved multiple modes of murder, each carefully chosen to conceal her culpability. Her first known criminal acts were financial in nature: fraud, deceit, and manipulation of personal relationships to extract money. However, these acts soon escalated to murder, motivated by a combination of greed, convenience, and cold calculation. Her victims were primarily men with whom she had intimate relationships, though she also murdered her own son, a grim demonstration of her capacity to override fundamental maternal instincts for personal gain. Her son, Michael, born with cerebral palsy and disabilities, was among her earliest victims. Judy claimed to be a caring mother, yet in 1971 she poisoned him with cyanide, an act intended to collect life insurance benefits. The death initially appeared natural, and forensic investigation at the time was limited, allowing her to evade immediate suspicion. This early act set a pattern. Victims were chosen carefully, often close in proximity and trust, and eliminated in a way that could initially seem accidental or natural. The choice of poison as a weapon reflected her methodical, calculated approach, a preference for invisibility and control over overt violence. Her adult victims followed a similar pattern. James Perry, her husband, was killed with a combination of explosives and deliberate poisoning in 1978. In each case, Judy not only removed individuals who stood in her way, but also ensured she profited financially, either through insurance payouts or inheritance. Her modus operandi involved meticulous planning, manipulation, and exploitation of societal blind spots, a caretaker's guise, the perception of vulnerability, and the expectation that a woman would not commit such crimes in cold blood. Investigators later noted the consistency in her methods, identifying patterns that ultimately led to her capture. Buenoano's connection to sex work, while not central to her identity, was relevant in understanding her manipulative skill set. She leveraged intimacy and sexual relationships to gain trust and access, demonstrating a practical, transactional understanding of human behavior. Unlike killers who act impulsively, Judy's crimes were premeditated, financially motivated, and carefully executed. She understood the power of proximity, influence, and social deception, crafting scenarios in which her victim's demise benefited her materially while minimizing suspicion. The investigation into Judy Buenoano's activities was painstaking and complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and sophisticated forensic work. Detectives faced challenges in linking disparate deaths, particularly because her methods, poisoning, staged accidents, and delayed effects, were subtle and easily masked as natural causes or unfortunate accidents. However, a combination of witness testimony, forensic advances, and careful cross-jurisdictional cooperation revealed the true scope of her crimes. Authorities confirmed at least 3 murders: her son Michael, her husband James Perry, and her fiancée Bobby Joe Morris. Evidence suggested, however, that she may have been responsible for additional deaths, including other partners and potential financial beneficiaries. Her trial in Florida in 1985 captivated public attention. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a woman whose charm, apparent vulnerability, and maternal facade masked a cold, calculating killer. Witnesses recounted her manipulations, deceptions, and the lengths she went to secure financial gain. Medical evidence, particularly the detection of cyanide and other toxic substances, provided concrete proof of her intent and capability. The jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to death, the first woman in Florida to receive the penalty for murder in decades. Her execution by electric chair in 1998 closed the chapter on a life defined by calculated cruelty and financial ambition. Psychological assessments of Judy Buenoano reveal a woman who combined traits of narcissism, sociopathy, and strategic intelligence. She was able to maintain an outward appearance of care, concern, and social conformity while orchestrating deaths for personal gain. Her crimes demonstrate how female serial killers often operate differently than their male counterparts. Through manipulation, strategic planning, and exploitation of relationships rather than overt, physically demonstrative violence. Buenoano's ability to combine domesticity, charm, and calculated cruelty made her a uniquely dangerous figure, both socially and criminally. The legacy of Judy Buenoano is both instructive and cautionary. Her case underscores the importance of forensic vigilance, the recognition of patterns in seemingly disparate deaths, and the potential for calculated predation in intimate or domestic contexts. For criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement, her life offers insights into motive, method, and the intersection of gender, power, and violence. The Black Widow moniker, while sensational, captures the essence of her methodology. A predator who leveraged relationships, trust, and proximity to execute murders with precision and gain. In sum, Judy Buenoano's life and crimes illustrate the disturbing potential for human cunning and manipulation to result in calculated murder. She orchestrated multiple deaths over decades, often exploiting the very social norms and expectations designed to protect individuals, trust in relationships, perception of domestic normalcy, and reliance on intimate partners. Her victims, including her own child, fell prey to a woman who could hide lethal intent behind charm, domesticity, and carefully constructed appearances. At least 3 confirmed victims, a suspected higher total, and a criminal legacy that informs modern criminology, law enforcement, and psychological study. Judy Buenoano stands as a stark reminder that evil can be patient, strategic, and terrifyingly disguised as ordinary life. Carol Ann Fugate is a figure often overshadowed by the notorious Charles Starkweather, yet her story provides a chilling insight into the blurred boundaries between influence, complicity, and criminality. Born in 1943 in Nebraska, Fugate grew up in a troubled family environment marked by economic instability and domestic strain. Her adolescence was turbulent, punctuated by rebellion and encounters with minor legal trouble. These early experiences shaped her vulnerability and suggestibility, factors that would later play a critical role in her involvement in one of the most infamous killing sprees of the late 1950s. Fugate's notoriety stems primarily from her teenage relationship with Charles Starkweather, a charismatic yet psychopathic young man whose killing spree across Nebraska and Wyoming in 1957-1958 resulted in 11 murders. Carol Ann was only 14 when she met Starkweather, and their relationship quickly became intense and controlling. While the extent of her active participation in the murders remains debated, it is clear that she became entangled in his crimes, traveling with him, aiding in evasion, and in some instances, assisting in logistical preparations. Starkweather's violent tendencies and manipulative charisma effectively ensnared Carol Ann, demonstrating the psychological power of coercion and influence in shaping criminal behavior. Following the end of the killing spree and Starkweather's eventual capture, Carol Ann Fugate was arrested and charged as an accomplice. The legal system grappled with her role. Was she a coerced victim, a naive adolescent, or an active participant in Starkweather's crimes? At trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a willing accomplice, emphasizing her presence during several murders and her assistance in fleeing from law enforcement. Defense attorneys argued that her youth, vulnerability, and fear of Starkweather's violence mitigated her culpability. Nevertheless, the court found her guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to life imprisonment, although her age spared her from the death penalty. Fugate served 18 years before being released, a period during which she maintained a low profile, ostensibly seeking rehabilitation and anonymity. What is less widely known is Fugate's later connection to sex work and further criminal suspicion. After her release, she lived under assumed names and, for a period, engaged in transactional sexual activity, sometimes for survival, sometimes opportunistically. This facet of her life, while not as criminally significant as her earlier involvement with Starkweather, offers insight into the persistent vulnerabilities and marginalization she experienced. It also underscores the complex interplay of coercion, economic necessity, and personal agency in the lives of women with criminal pasts. Carol Ann Fugate's story is particularly instructive when examining the influence of environment, relationships, and psychological manipulation on criminal development. Unlike classic serial killers who operate independently, Fugate's criminal trajectory was profoundly shaped by a dominant, violent partner. Her youth, isolation, and susceptibility to coercion illustrate how external forces can catalyze participation in lethal acts, even for individuals who might not independently exhibit homicidal tendencies. Criminologists studying her case often cite her as an example of coerced complicity, highlighting the nuanced spectrum between perpetrator and victim in criminal psychology. Moreover, Fugate's later engagement in sex work reflects a continuity in her social navigation skills. Just as she had once relied on relationships to survive or gain mobility, she later utilized personal interactions in transactional contexts, echoing the skills that had facilitated her earlier entanglement with Starkweather. This continuity suggests a pattern of leveraging interpersonal influence, whether coerced or voluntary, to navigate the world, a pattern that in earlier contexts intersected tragically with lethal criminal activity. Fugate's case also raises profound ethical and societal questions about culpability, rehabilitation, and the treatment of young offenders. How should the legal system account for individuals coerced into violent acts by older, dominant figures? To what extent can a teenager, subjected to manipulation and fear, be held morally and legally accountable? Her life challenges simple categorizations. She is neither wholly victim nor entirely perpetrator, existing in a complex space defined by coercion, compliance, and survival instincts. This ambiguity has made her a subject of enduring interest in criminal justice studies, psychological research, and true crime discourse. Despite the notoriety of her early life, Carol Ann Fugate lived much of her adult years away from public attention. She did not return to large-scale criminal activity, and her later years were marked by attempts at ordinary life, although the shadows of her teenage involvement with Starkweather inevitably lingered. Yet even in these quieter periods, her story serves as a cautionary tale. It illustrates the long-lasting impact of violent relationships, the consequences of early exposure to criminal behavior, and the persistent challenges faced by individuals seeking reintegration after extraordinary circumstances. From a criminological perspective, Carol Ann Fugate's life offers critical insights into the intersection of youth, manipulation, and criminality. Her involvement with Starkweather demonstrates how age, coercion, and psychological influence can lead to complicity in lethal acts, while her later experiences reflect the ongoing negotiation of survival and agency in the context of marginalization. For psychologists, legal scholars, and criminologists, Fugate's story underscores the importance of understanding the multifaceted nature of criminal participation, particularly in cases involving minors or highly coercive interpersonal dynamics. In sum, Carol Ann Fugate's narrative is one of tragedy, manipulation, and the blurred lines between victimhood and criminality. She is inseparable from the violent legacy of Charles Starkweather, yet her life extends beyond that partnership, reflecting enduring struggles with autonomy, survival, and societal reintegration. Her story serves as a reminder that criminal behavior often exists within complex relational, social, and psychological networks, and that the journey from coercion to complicity can be both rapid and devastating. Carol Ann Fugate remains an essential case study in understanding how influence, youth, and opportunity intersect in the genesis of criminal acts, an enduring lesson for law enforcement, psychology, and society alike. Sheila LaBarre is a chilling example of how charisma, control, and obsession can combine to produce a female predator who operates under the guise of normalcy while inflicting terror on those closest to her. Born in 1960 in Massachusetts, Sheila experienced a deeply troubled upbringing marked by instability, alleged abuse, and early signs of psychological disturbance. Reports indicate that her family life was tumultuous, contributing to patterns of behavior characterized by manipulation, paranoia, and a need for dominance. These early formative experiences, experts suggest, were instrumental in shaping a personality capable of extreme control over others, setting the stage for a disturbing adult life. LaBarre relocated to New Hampshire as a young adult, where she established herself in small rural communities. At first glance, she appeared unremarkable, a quiet, seemingly friendly woman who lived alone and managed her household with care. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a calculating mind attuned to the vulnerabilities of men, particularly those seeking intimacy, companionship, or guidance. Over time, Sheila cultivated relationships with men who were often socially isolated, dependent, or easily manipulated. These men were drawn to her charisma, her apparent empathy, and her feigned nurturing qualities. A classic setup for what would become a pattern of coercion and, ultimately, violence. Unlike many female serial killers who rely on direct methods such as poisoning, Sheila's approach combined psychological domination with lethal intent. She exerted control over her male companions through fear, threats, and emotional manipulation, compelling them to live under her strict rules in her home. Some reports describe her tactics as a form of domestic captivity. She demanded obedience, controlled movement, and maintained constant surveillance over those under her influence. It is within this context of domination and psychological control that the murders occurred. At least 2 men were confirmed victims, although suspicion remains that her influence may have extended to additional deaths, either directly or indirectly. Investigators suggested that some deaths could have resulted from coercion and neglect rather than direct violence, highlighting the broad spectrum of methods she employed to maintain power and eliminate obstacles. One of the most disturbing aspects of Sheila LaBarre's criminal pattern is her use of sexual dependency as a tool for control. Although she was not formally a sex worker, she leveraged sexual relationships to manipulate men, ensuring loyalty and obedience. Victims were compelled to live as though they were her clients in a psychological sense, surrendering autonomy and becoming trapped in a system of fear and compliance. This exploitation of intimacy demonstrates how Sheila transformed relational and sexual dynamics into instruments of domination and, eventually, murder. Her victims' trust was weaponized, and their vulnerability became a resource for her criminal endeavors. Sheila's arrest in the mid-2000s followed growing suspicions within the community and reports of missing men associated with her household. Law enforcement investigations uncovered evidence of confinement, threats, and the deaths of at least 2 men under suspicious circumstances. Witness testimony revealed the extent of her psychological manipulation and control, painting a portrait of a woman who combined intellect, charm, and ruthlessness. Forensic evidence was critical in establishing a direct link to the victims, and subsequent interrogation and confessions clarified her role in orchestrating the environment that led to their deaths. At trial, Sheila LaBarre presented a complex figure, intelligent, articulate, and capable of rational explanation, yet morally detached and capable of sustained coercion. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of her crimes, the manipulation of vulnerable men, and her role in creating circumstances that facilitated death. Defense arguments focused on psychological instability, alleging that her actions were influenced by long-standing trauma and mental health issues. Nonetheless, the jury concluded that Sheila's behavior was deliberate, methodical, and criminally culpable. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that her capacity to manipulate and harm would be curtailed. Psychologists and criminologists examining Sheila LaBarre's case note several key patterns. First, her crimes exemplify the coercive female predator model, in which manipulation, dominance, and exploitation of dependency replace direct physical violence as the primary instrument of control. Second, her ability to integrate herself into socially normal roles, neighbor, friend, pseudo-caregiver, enabled her to evade detection for years. Finally, her actions illustrate how psychological control, when combined with isolation, rural environments, and limited oversight, can produce lethal outcomes even in the absence of overt aggression or visible weapons. Sheila LaBarre's life and crimes also highlight societal assumptions about gender and violence. Communities often underestimate the capacity for female perpetrators to exert extreme control, assuming that aggression is primarily male or overtly physical. Sheila's manipulation of trust, sexual dependency, and domestic authority demonstrates how women can exploit social norms and expectations to commit murder while maintaining a semblance of normality. Her case challenges criminologists, sociologists, and law enforcement to recognize the nuanced ways in which female-perpetrated crimes can manifest and the complex psychological dynamics involved. In addition, Sheila's case serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of socially isolated individuals. Her victims were often men seeking companionship, guidance, or intimacy, qualities that Sheila exploited to establish dominance. By controlling their environment, restricting their freedom, and leveraging psychological dependence, she created a situation in which her will became lethal. This underscores the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and psychological profiling in preventing similar tragedies in rural or isolated settings. Ultimately, Sheila LaBarre's story is one of calculated cruelty, psychological manipulation, and the weaponization of trust and intimacy. Her crimes, confirmed to involve at least 2 deaths with suspicions of more, reveal a methodical mind capable of sustaining control over vulnerable individuals while eluding immediate detection. She exemplifies a distinct category of female serial predators, one in which intellect, coercion, and domestic facades are as deadly as knives or guns. For criminologists, psychologists, and students of criminal behavior, Sheila LaBarre stands as a stark reminder that predation often wears the mask of normalcy, trust, and care, and that danger can reside quietly, patiently, and devastatingly close. Belle Gunness, one of the most infamous female killers in American history, occupies a notorious place in the annals of crime. Born in 1859 in Norway, Belle immigrated to the United States as a young woman, seeking opportunity in the growing industrial and agricultural landscape of the Midwest. She settled in La Porte, Indiana, where she established a farm and later a seemingly ordinary household. Yet, beneath the veneer of domesticity lay a mind capable of cold calculation, extreme cruelty, and a profound disregard for human life. Belle's life is a disturbing study of how domestic skills, charm, and strategic planning can mask one of the deadliest criminal careers in U.S. history. Before marriage, Belle reportedly engaged in occasional prostitution, a fact that foreshadowed her skill in using sexual access and personal relationships as a tool for manipulation. She was adept at reading men, understanding their desires and vulnerabilities, and exploiting them to gain trust. This early experience provided her with a unique perspective on human behavior, which she would later translate into a lethal criminal strategy. Belle's first known murders involved men who courted her or proposed marriage. Some sources suggest that her earliest victims were suitors whom she killed to obtain insurance payouts, land, or property, while others indicate she may have been motivated by deeper psychological impulses, including a desire for control and dominance. The The hallmark of Belle Gunness's criminal career was the systematic and deliberate elimination of individuals for financial gain. Her preferred method often combined deceit, poison, and brute force. She lured men to her farm under the guise of marriage, companionship, or business dealings, then orchestrated their deaths in a manner that concealed foul play. Victims were buried on her property, often in shallow graves or hidden areas around her farm, making detection difficult. Some reports suggest that she may have killed over 40 individuals, including husbands, lovers, and even children, though exact numbers remain uncertain due to incomplete records and the passage of time. Among her victims were both adults and children, demonstrating a lack of moral restraint and a terrifying willingness to eliminate anyone who obstructed her plans. Belle's methods were notable not only for their lethality, but also for their cunning. She used her domestic skills, cooking, caretaking, and household management to maintain the appearance of a normal, even nurturing life, while systematically disposing of her victims. This duality allowed her to evade suspicion for years, highlighting a pattern common among organized female serial killers: the blending of ordinary domesticity with extraordinary cruelty. Her ability to manipulate societal expectations, combined with her strategic planning, made her a formidable predator whose crimes went undetected until patterns of disappearance and financial fraud drew attention. The unraveling of Belle Gunness's crimes began in 1908, when a fire destroyed her farmhouse. In the aftermath, investigators discovered multiple bodies buried on her property, including adults and children, along with evidence suggesting that some victims were not related to her household. The discovery shocked the community and revealed the staggering scale of her criminal enterprise. Although Belle herself was reported missing and presumed dead in the fire, suspicions lingered that she had faked her death to escape prosecution. Subsequent investigations, including forensic and law enforcement efforts, attempted to identify the full extent of her victims, but the combination of time, fire damage, and deliberate concealment ensured that the complete truth might never be known. Belle Gunness's legacy is complex and unsettling. She represents a type of female serial killer who relies on intellect, deception, and domestic trust rather than overt physical aggression. Her early exposure to prostitution and her understanding of human desires allowed her to manipulate men with chilling effectiveness. By integrating herself into social and domestic norms, she was able to operate undetected for years, illustrating the dangers of underestimating women as capable of sustained, premeditated, lethal behavior. Criminologists often cite her as a prime example of the Black Widow archetype, a predator who combines sexual, emotional, and financial manipulation to lethal effect. From a psychological perspective, Belle Gunness exhibited traits of extreme narcissism, antisocial behavior, and calculated opportunism. She understood the societal expectations of women in her era and leveraged them to disguise her intentions. Her victims' trust became a tool for execution. Their dependency and attraction facilitated their deaths. In this way, she transformed ordinary domesticity into a mechanism of power and control, demonstrating how intellect, strategy, and manipulation can serve as instruments of murder. Her ability to plan, deceive, and execute murders over decades reflects an intelligence and cunning that continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and historians. The story of Belle Gunness also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring anomalies in seemingly ordinary lives. Her outward appearance, a widow, homemaker, or caretaker, masked a pattern of exploitation and lethal calculation. By examining her crimes, modern law enforcement and criminal psychologists gain insight into the ways female predators may operate under the guise of normalcy, using trust, intimacy, and domestic skills as instruments of murder. The combination of financial motivation, psychological manipulation, and premeditated violence makes her one of the most instructive and horrifying cases in American criminal history. In conclusion, Belle Gunness's life and crimes illustrate the terrifying potential for deception, intelligence, and domestic skills to be weaponized in the pursuit of murder. She is estimated to have killed over 40 individuals, possibly more, using a combination of cunning, social manipulation, and calculated violence. Her early ties to prostitution, strategic exploitation of men's trust, and ability to conceal her actions under a facade of domestic normalcy make her an enduring study in female criminality. Belle Gunness remains a chilling reminder that evil can be patient, methodical, and terrifyingly ordinary in appearance, an extraordinary predator hidden in plain sight.